Hi, this is Scott. I really appreciate our sponsors because they make the show possible. Today's show is sponsored by Telerik. Create compelling app experiences across any screen with the Telerik platform. Telerik's end-to-end platform uniquely combines industry-leading UI tools with cloud services to simplify the entire app development cycle. Telerik offers everything .NET developers need to build quality apps faster. Try it free at telerik.com/platform. That's telerik.com/platform.
From HanselMinutes.com, it's Hansel Minutes, a weekly discussion with web developer and technologist Scott Hanselman. This is Lawrence Ryan announcing show number 443. In this episode, Scott talks with Claudina Sarahe about the Sass CSS preprocessor.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes, and I'm here at BlendConf in North Carolina, and I'm talking with Claudina Sarahe.
Mm-hmm.
Did I get that right?
You did.
Thank you so much. And you gave a workshop at this conference on Sass.
Yep.
4 hours you talked about Sass.
3, but you can give me that extra credit.
Okay,
Absolutely.
I'll give you that extra free hour. You could even probably spend a week talking about Sass.
I could spend a week. I could spend a day at least for the workshop. You definitely need a lot of time. It's too much to get into.
It seems like there, and I think that people who are programmers like to say that there's two kinds of people in the world, in whatever situation. And it feels like there's people who write CSS, and there's people who really architect it. There's people who craft it and who care about it. Why is there that dichotomy between the people that just bang out some CSS versus people who make well modularized, thoughtful, large-scale CSS?
Well, I think we're actually at the time where we can actually architect CSS, and this is what preprocessors have allowed us to do. Mm-hmm. And prior to that, it was difficult. It wasn't impossible, and Nicole Sullivan came out with OOCSS as a convention for starting to do this with what we had, which was class names in your CSS file. But CSS is a very flat language. So what can you do with that? You need more dynamic tools. So these preprocessors have really opened the door for it, but we're dealing with this sort of baggage of development where we weren't really thinking like architects or weren't really designing our systems. So that's the new hurdle to get around on top of now having to learn this new language. So those are the challenges.
When I've created CSS, and I'm not a designer, but I can hack my way around a decent site, and I've done CSS on all of my sites. I've either done it two ways: started from a blank page or like a reset CSS, and then gone from there and done my best to build something. And then I got it to a point where it was nice. And then a week or two goes by and I need to make a change. And inevitably that change...
Stick it at the bottom of the...
Yes, it's a line at the bottom. So fast forward 4 years, I think there's more at the bottom than there ever was before, but I'm afraid to touch it.
The bottom of your
no,
file?
Like the entire file. I'm just like, it works, right? It cascades, and I could rearrange the thing and it might just stop working because something might override something else.
You're just going to leave it be.
And it's all in site.css. Save me. Where did I go wrong?
Well, I mean,
what I'm saying is that do I start with like a master.css and then just get to a point where I need to start breaking this up into pieces?
Oh, like the process for sort of coming into Sass or re-architecting a file with Sass?
I think like if I'm starting in a greenfield development or I'm writing it from scratch, right? Because most CSS people I have talked to say that if it gets into a rat's nest, just really don't try to re-architect it, don't try to refactor it. Just think of it as a reference. Get rid of it and start from scratch and then write it. And you'll find it'll be smaller. It's almost like if you lose a term paper, you can mourn the paper, you can try to recover the paper, but frankly, if you just write it again, the second time is going to be better.
Yeah, I actually have had a lot of discussions with sort of this idea of refactoring with Gina Bolton and Elise Holiday. And the truth is that not everyone can throw away their giant, crazy site.css files. We had a woman yesterday in the workshop who was like, this is great. We have this giant file and I have to figure out how to port our CSS to Sass. And so one of the things I started out with, which I think is really important and is sort of one of the areas where we can get the most gain, is how you organize your file directory with Sass because it is new. We no longer have this monolithic site.css or screen or main. We now have these tiny little partials where we can put things into. But again, what do you put into it and what goes in there? So I spent some time definitely talking about that. And I think, my approach when you're dealing with refactoring would be follow this sort of organization, which I modified from Dale Sandy, who's done a really good job thinking about ways to what he calls avoid your Sass junk drawer. And then through my work at Oddbird and our little experiments, we've modified this. And
is this something we can get to? Is this on GitHub?
Yeah, it's in my. Do you have links to it?
I will put links in the show notes.
Awesome. I will give you a link to it. But yeah, I would start out by really the thing about Sass is you have this directory, which is like your base, which is finally sort of setting up your variables and the things that you need, like setting up your tools that you need to build all your other components.
Okay.
And so a refactoring adventure for me might be looking at that monolithic CSS thing and being like, okay, these are sort of grouped together and these form like my author section. And then I would yank that out into its own partial and keep doing that until I've got sort of an idea of what the separate components are. And then from there, you can continue down your refactoring adventure to make it more and more sassy. So
then I could take these are all colors that are associated with this brand, and then those would be colors.
Yep. And then I would move that into colors.config file, and I would say these are all my colors and they're here, and these are all my font stuff and they're here, and we do some stuff with sizing to try to keep those pretty consistent so that you're not
so that's interesting. So you're saying the size of a button and you want it to be the same everywhere.
Yeah, we actually have little helpers for sizing that we use for even margin or padding, and they're very simple. We have 3 names. Shim is the tiniest, and then we have gutter and column, and it's just you start to think that way. You're like, in this space I want small, and in this one I want a little larger.
Oh, okay. So you're saying to keep, I can understand the obvious stuff, consolidate my colors, but consolidating my white space almost into its own partial. Okay.
Sizing tool. Yeah.
Sizing tool. Okay. Yes. So let me back up a little bit for some of the people who are more kind of Sass 101 type people.
Sure.
It's a preprocessor, so it effectively elevates CSS to a kind of a full programming language that compiles into a target, where that target is CSS.
Yes.
And as such, I can plug different things into it.
Yeah, it actually, I think one of the coolest things that's happened with the recent advance in Sass is we have Sass maps, and maps are a hash or array, very common to any other programming language. Some brilliant people in Sass have written extensions that allow you to actually take your Sass map and convert it to JSON, which is crazy, which now means that you can convert CSS to JSON, which is an interchangeable data format that allows you to now communicate with any language.
Wow. And I'm not sure how I'm supposed to feel about that. That's pretty mind-bending.
It's pretty awesome. It's really great for style guides, actually. For making maintainable style guides, in the sense that one of the things that front-end people bemoan is oh, I've added a new color. Now I have to go to my style guide and copy and paste this thing. And I'm like, nope, I just add a new color to my map. It exports to JSON. And then in my template, I loop through my JSON file.
I see. Okay. So all of the sizes and the colors become data. They're just data trapped in Sass. You compile that to JSON, and then just like any other template you find.
Yeah, so I use a lot of that mostly for style guide stuff.
That's really the only thing, documentation effect.
Yeah. But I think to me that's one of the most powerful things when you're like, wow, this gets to talk to any language now. When did we have that with CSS? We never had that. So that's a whole new.
Well, and it makes CSS kind of addressable. HTML is addressable. I can access the DOM. JavaScript is the thing that we address it with. And then CSS was kind of bolted onto the side. It was just this thing that was along for the ride. And the
thing that makes beauty on the web. It's a very important language. It's the reason that things look nice and that we can actually use things. I mean, it's not just, and it's terrible and flat on its own, but not anymore.
And when I talked to one of the people who worked on Sass kind of early on, what was the gentleman's name?
Hampton.
Mm-hmm. He was saying that he didn't understand why it wasn't such an obvious thing for the CSS people to just do. Just add some hierarchy, and that's a good start. Why did we not do that? Why was CSS so flat and the problems that caused?
I don't know enough about the history of CSS to.
I guess it's more of a. Sass happened because there was an idea vacuum. There was something that was like there was a pain.
Yeah, but it actually took a really long time for it to get adopted. It took like 7 years before this thing is now.
Really?
Yeah.
It was just floating out there that many years ago?
It took a while. It really took a while before people were into it. And there's actually, so-called like some of the bigger names in front end for a while were just like, I don't know why you would even want to use this thing called a preprocessor, and this is bad, and you can't do it. And it's just like, well, what actually I think forced people around it was these device constraints, and it became impossible to deal with so many devices with a flat language. There's just, we're designers, which at our heart means that we're architects, and we're looking for patterns, and we're pulling these things together and trying to figure out how these systems work. Mm-hmm. And we need languages that let us do that. And so I think people finally realized and came to.
It seems like there was a sense of not wanting to repeat ourselves, right? This idea of being dry. Mm-hmm. And it reached a pain where it's like, okay, fine, this is just ridiculous. I have repeated myself with this color or these margins so many times. Now we need variables. Where is that tool?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, the variables were definitely sort of the first thing that would sell everyone. You'd be like, look, you no longer have to write this color over and over and over again.
It's the gateway drug, though.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Ooh, red. Look at it go. One variable.
But what are mixins?
Mixins are ways of sharing like blocks of code, but the difference is that they take arguments, so you can manipulate like the data. So you can create this reusable property block, but let's say, for example, yesterday in my workshop, I used the notifications as an example, where you have the general structure of a notification that can be shared, but then you might have 3 different types of a notification. You might have
like a pop-up.
Yes, like an alert, a warning, and you might different colors. So we can create a mixin to share sort of the color styles and manipulations, and we pass in one argument, which would be color, and then it can generate all the rest of the properties.
See, that just clicked in my head. That is a really great analogy, because you're going to want the buttons to be the same. You're going to want the thing to lay out the same. Maybe you'll have a box shadow. It's going to be spaced. It's going to be 90% the same for these different classes of error messages. But you want the flexibility to change something fundamentally.
Yeah. So this one is pretty neat in the sense that you pass one color, which is the background color. And then because Sass has crazy color functions, I can use Sass color functions to take one color and then derive a text color and a border color and a nice drop shadow color. And I can even be smart enough to say, okay, Sass, if my background is dark, I want you to manipulate this color so we make a lighter text color. If I have a light background color, I know I need to do a different manipulation because my text color needs to be dark. Like, you could not do that with CSS.
Interesting. Okay, so let's dig into that for a little bit. So in the past, it's mostly go to Photoshop, use the little
what color is this?
I call it the Legend of Zelda sword because it looks like the eyedrop picker.
The eye picker.
So you go and then you basically just start memorizing the hex, copy pasting it. Right.
So much copy paste. I actually haven't opened Photoshop in such a long time. My life is better.
That's good. So you're saying that I can just say my base is sky blue, and then say, 2 hue steps down or 2 saturations in this direction?
Yeah, you can actually work with HSL, which is really great.
So as a designer, it thinks the way a designer thinks then. Because I assume you guys think in terms of, you said HSL. Can you explain what hue and
saturation, lightness? Just preface that I'm not a designer, but HSL makes sense to me in my brain because it's easier to work with. So the idea is that hue is 0 to 360, so color exists on a color wheel. So red is 0 and 360, and then you're moving around from there. Purple, I think, is maybe like 200-ish. So you start to memorize where things go. Saturation is how much gray you're adding to something, more or less gray, and then lightness is how light or dark that color is. So you can really easily create these manipulations. And for someone, like for me especially, I'm like, well, this makes sense. I can take one color and do some light little modifications and create an actually like pretty decent looking design.
Well, and it's it seems to me like it's a much more disciplined and much more focused way to solve a problem, in the sense of, I, as a non-designer, and in this interaction, I'm going to call you, even though you're not a designer, you're a hell of a lot more of a designer than I am. I'm going to look at a blue and I'm going to go, that blue next to it kind of looks okay, and I'm going to eyeball it.
Yeah.
But someone else is going to say, this is our base blue, this is our base green, I want 20% more saturation.
Yep.
I don't really care what the resulting hex value is. I just know that I want to be very focused about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then add that to my style guide, and then I'm going to get consistent. And I assume I could get my site, could I get my Sass down to like a very small number of base colors and calculate everything else?
Absolutely. I actually try to strive for that, is really just reducing sort of the number of variables that you have and then using these functions for manipulation to create the other things that you need. So you're not creating like before, I think people would do like a background color, then a text color and a drop down text shadow color and a border color. And that's fine. But, that's still that's also not very dry. So even though I think it's one of the things I also stress when I'm teaching is like Sass still compiles down to CSS. So we do need to be aware of that. And then there are ways within our Sass code when we're architecting it that we can also be, more dry and less wet. And so I think colors is a great example where you can try to derive the rest of it from one that's much better than setting like a giant colors variable file.
Could I write my Sass poorly that I might end up with CSS that is way more complicated than I want? Like, is it one of those things where I just ignore that there's this generated file and pretend it doesn't exist?
You should always be looking at your generated file, always, especially when you're learning, because it's also important to see. That's how you begin to understand like exactly what it's doing. Because most people are like, it's magic. It's like, no, it still compiles down to something the browser understands. So you need to make sure that that's okay. So I think it's the best way to always keep them side by side.
So if something's wrong, is it to mean I'm doing Sass wrong, or do I need to give it hints? Are there ways to say
wrong? Sort of in what sense? Like
I don't know. Let's say that I do something and it kind of explodes into this kind of Cartesian product of colors, and it's like, wow, this is way more information than that selector needed. Like this property block is more expressive because I had a mix in with a mix in or whatever, and it just kind of like,
yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yep.
Can I do anything with the generated file, or it all has to flow from Sass to CSS?
It has to flow from Sass to CSS. Yeah. The generated file is more like, oh, whoa, whoops, I might be nesting this thing incorrectly, or I may have extended a property without realizing that it's within another, and it just created a nightmare. So
I understand that. Is it true that I can write some JavaScript and evaluate JavaScript evaluations within Sass, and then that can expand out? I can basically have JavaScript expressions, like ifs and stuff.
Oh, like the control directions, like ifs each.
In my Sass. So what would I use that for?
Control directives. Well, for example, when we were talking about color and being able to test, you're going to use, that's a control directive right there.
Oh,
so yeah, if you're basically saying if the lightness of this color is greater than 50%, then perform this action, else do something else. So you can use if and else statements are really, really powerful.
I see. So if a color got too light, I could block it from getting any lighter, or I could,
or you can even tell, like, it's a great way for designing mix-ins for being like, well, if I've defined this argument or I've set this, then I need you to print out these other CSS properties. Otherwise, don't. We don't actually need them. So, they're really, really, really powerful. And each, is the other one that I think is really used a lot, and especially with maps, and especially used to actually generate CSS for you, which is incredible.
One of the things that I think is worth pointing out, and I think the listeners will agree, is that for a lot of us who work on large systems inside of enterprises, and we haven't built kind of a modern, and I'm saying that in air quotes, a modern app, a modular app with a client-side build process in a while. We have some JavaScript we put in a file, and then we ship that JavaScript. We have some CSS, we put it in a file, and we ship that. But the new way of doing things is not just a server-side build for applications that compile on the server, but also a client-side build process. This, it sounds like you could have really sophisticated, complex CSS that is truly architected, that can be managed by many, many people, and you're going to have not just one designer working on one file, but a whole team sharing these different visual languages, sharing these mix-ins, and that's all part of a build process. And is that the kind of do you find yourself working on those projects, or are these CSSs that one person can understand? Because I feel like it's getting complicated enough that I'm going to not be able to fit it all in my head on one project.
Do I find myself working on teams where
I guess I'm trying to say that suddenly I went from being one file to being a whole series. I've got functions, and I've got colors, and I've got mixins, and I've got libraries, and I just didn't expect CSS to go in that direction. And is this something that works better when I have teams? Like if you're working with 3 other people who are managing your front end CSS work, do you each work in the same file? Do you break it up so that you can be working in separate parts of the Sass? And can you get into situations where someone makes a change and then it breaks the entire style sheet because they made one variable change? It's so dry now that it cascades more than ever.
Yeah, the good thing is that if it's a change that the compiler doesn't like, it won't actually let it happen, which is nice. You can't compile horrible things because the compiler will choke.
Because it's basically linting. It is compiled, and if it's not,
it has to be valid. Yeah, it has to be valid.
Of course,
CSS. In terms of working with teams, there's only one other front end developer on my team, so it makes it a lot easier. And we have a very, very big focus about building tools. And so we're very, very aware of okay, we are reusing this snippet of code or this idea a lot. How can we make something better? So we have a big focus on making better tools internally. I definitely think, that of course there's going to be more complexity when you're dealing with multiple people on a team. And the added complexities of just, am I putting my code in the right partial? Which partial should this go into? Where should it go? What's going to happen? And I think all of that, again, comes down to the beginning and the setup and how are you designing and architecting your project? Okay. And I just feel that we at least in front end, we don't have the mindset. We haven't wrapped our head around this completely. We are architects. This is not, okay, the designer's now given us the PSD and we should just go start taking it apart. You need to sit down and look at it and be okay, what are these actual components? What things do we have here? And if you're really sort of forward thinking, you're going to start to build your own little framework and sort of pattern library so that you can get through things faster, and help you out, and conventions that work for you and your team. And so I think that can be the hard thing, especially because it's so new now that everyone's well, what's the best way? What's the best thing? And it's you know what? The best way for me is not the best way for you, because my team and my requirements are different. And you need to analyze it from what are your goals and your objectives and what do you have at your disposal. So
you expressed that so much better. I apologize for my muddled question. I think what you expressed it so much better than I did. I think what I was trying to get my head around was this idea that the intentionality of it suddenly changed, and you just expressed it so well. And you said that your team member and you are making a set of tools, and those tools are these property blocks and these mixins and these colors and these color functions. Where what is it exactly we're trying to accomplish? How are we going to architect that solution to solve this problem for the business? And we're going to build a reusable set of tools. And you and that other designer, or if you had more designers, are all on the same team. And these are the things we value. It's that intentionality of that arc.
Yeah, the communication and talking and all these. Those things are hard already on their own. And then when you add this new language that can create more complexities, where you're well, I stuck it in that partial and I put it there and I imported it there, and it's you got to have sort of rules around it. And I think that at least if you're on a team, if you're just what's going on with my CSS? Why is this a disorder? Then maybe you should look at how are we interacting as a team?
And that speaks to the, if they, to call back to the beginning of the conversation, if they just stick it at the bottom.
Exactly.
then you're going to smack them down and you're going to be hey, come on.
And that can still easily happen. Someone will just be oh yeah, I put it in a partial, then I imported the partial at the bottom. And it's just no. Even the import file has an order to it. Read it.
And this isn't just being uptight. Some people might be listening and going, oh, they're just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It's all going to be chaos. Anyway, but a really well architected Sass system is a thing of beauty.
Oh yeah, it's amazing, right? It's a great building. It's when you walk in and you're everything is right.
It's all in its place.
Yeah. When I was in school, I always thought I wanted to study architecture, and I never did. I ended up dropping out of school, taking a year off, and then I was like, oh, this web thing is really fun. I actually moved to Portland, Oregon, when I took a year off. That's where I went.
Okay.
That's where I got started. And so I had this theory in school. I was like, well, you can take poetry, which is a system in of itself, and you can design for it. So that when you go somewhere, you can elicit a certain type of design. So I think that's the beauty of a well-architected file, is that it's like you're showing your ability to like think through these requirements, and not only have you translated it into like the final website, which like for users to interact, like we as developers, we interact with our files and we should take care of them too. So
it's a garden that needs to be tended, and if a weed pops up at the bottom of the file, you got to pull that weed.
Clean it, yeah, because too many weeds and you're like, I don't care about this garden anymore. You just want to throw it away.
So at the beginning, we mentioned that you did a 3-hour workshop, but it could have been a week long. You're actually a conference organizer. You have a conference. What is your conference?
Sass Conf.
So there's an entire conference about Sass.
About Sass, right?
Which I think the reason I'm saying it like that, with that kind of gravitas, is that it's so powerful and it's so significant. And the idea of a large system that is architected well, that is then agile enough to respond to changes in the design, needs books and conferences and tools like this. So tell me about your conference. How long is it? What kinds of people should go to SassConf?
Well, if you're a Sass enthusiast, definitely come. But
what if you don't know Sass?
Come too. We bill it as a conference for people that want to make a better web, and not only for users, but like for ourselves as developers. So also caring about that developer experience. And SassConf this year is going to be October 2nd through 4th in New York City again. And this year it's 3 days. So we have a full single track conference day. Tab Atkins is our keynote, which I'm super excited about. And then we have,
who's that?
Tab Atkins is the spec hacker over at Google. So he does a lot with the CSS spec, which is really neat. And when you think about, I think the other power of Sass is how it's influencing decisions that are coming out in CSS. And, but again, this sort of idea of, I'm like, well, if Sass can convert to JSON, then who knows? Maybe the browser one day will just decide to understand something else.
But it does make one wonder that we see things like CoffeeScript or TypeScript influencing the future of JavaScript. Is there a convergence coming where it's going to be, here are the angle brackets and here are the curly braces? And the curly braces are both CSS and JavaScript. CSS with inline JavaScript or JavaScript with inline CSS.
Who knows, right?
We'll find out at SassConf.
We will find out what Tab has to say. And then our second day is workshops. You can pick between 2 4-hour workshops. And our third day this year is our community unconference day, which I'm super, super excited about. And last year was the first time that everyone in this community came together, and it was powerful to see Chris and Hampton and Natalie and people who have been organizing for years, and for the first time they hadn't seen each other for years, and here we all were.
All virtually.
And here we were, together, coming together for the first time, saying we really love this thing, and we want to hang out as a community, and we want to make it better, and a lot's happened since then within the Sass community, and it's just, it's a wonderful place. I'm so happy to be there.
Speaking just a little bit about kind of quote unquote the competition, there are other preprocessors
always,
right? There was less kind of for a while that has fallen out of favor. Is that fair to say?
Less is still there, unless if Twitter Bootstrap hadn't started with less, I don't think it would be as prominent. And I actually worked with Les. I started with Sass, and then I worked with Les, and then I went back to Sass. And I think the biggest difference around it is where's the community around Les? A, and B, there's no way to contribute to Les. I think one of the things that's and you can actually see this with the influence of jQuery to JavaScript. If you remember, before jQuery came out, JavaScript was just kind of this. It's like, oh gosh, JavaScript, right?
Yep.
And then
that's really good. I love the way you say that. Before, yes. Oh gosh, JavaScript, JavaScript. Yes, that's exactly what.
And
it
now
felt
it's like JavaScript. It's crazy. It's like the hottest thing ever. But what jQuery did was that it created a way for people to contribute back. And if you look at the initial blog posts, like the first day, John's like, oh, I released it. And the second day, he was like, I've created this way for people to submit plugins, and someone already submitted a plugin. And that took off. And that's what Sass did. Sass created this way for people to share their work, which is really new in CSS. You can't share your giant site.css file and show me that I'm like, what am I going to learn from this?
Yeah, you don't want to see it.
Exactly. Right. So now we have ways to create tools that we can share and people can contribute. And I think that is why Sass has really shot ahead of all the other ones. It's also just more powerful than us. So.
Very cool. So I'm going to add all of the links that we talked about in the show notes. People can go to SassConf this October 2014. They can go to the conference day. There's the workshops, and then the last day is like an open spaces, a community day.
Community day. IBM is running a hackathon. There's a large panel discussion between Zerb and Thoughtbot, but otherwise it's come share what you want to share or hack on whatever you want to hack.
Rock on. Well, thanks so much for chatting with me.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.